So how important is it to have a great IQ? Let's go down memory lane. The man with the greatest IQ of all time was a man called William J. Sidis. He had an IQ of between 250 to 300. He became a Harvard professor at the age of 16. But when you look at his life, you see that he never really accomplished anything significant outside his academic prowess. In fact, after a while, he began living from place to place. He became like a nomad. He adopted libertarian views, and his end was quite shameful compared to the kind of intelligence that he had. But let's go through a couple of other people. Garry Kasparov, the greatest chess player of all time, has an IQ of 190. Great, impressive. Great man. We can look at Christopher Hirata, professor at Ohio State University with an IQ of 210. Or Terence Tao, professor of mathematics at UCLA with an IQ of 220. And take a look at Philip Emeagwali, who has an IQ of 190. But when we compare this to some of the greatest men who ever lived, Steve Jobs, for example, is one of the most definitive figures of the last 50 to 100 years. His IQ was lower than 150. We can talk about other people like Albert Einstein didn't even have an IQ that was higher than 180. Isaac Newton, of course, had an IQ of 190, but there are several people. Elon Musk, if you do a test of his IQ, you find out that he doesn't even have the IQ of some of those great geniuses I spoke about, like Terence Tao, Christopher Hirata, and William J. Sidis. So how important is it to have a high IQ, or is the definitive factor in success in life a high IQ? My answer to that is a definitive no. And why do I say so? I say so because beyond IQ, I think more important than IQ is EQ. A lot of us have established that and agree with that. But more than EQ, I think there are two other quotients that are very necessary. One, I call it RQ, quotient for relentlessness, and then the other one is CQ, your quotient for creativity. You see, you can be academically smart, you could be a genius academically, and yet you don't have the kind of results, you don't have the kind of impact to society that other people with lower IQ had. So I think success in life is a combination of four quotients: IQ, EQ, CQ, creativity quotient, and then finally relentless quotient. If you combine all those four qualities, you'll find out that you are not only a blessing to yourself, but you are a blessing to humanity in general. Let's not forget that people like John Sununu, former special advisor to George H.W. Bush, was the smartest in the George W. Bush administration. But if you look at the top 5 politicians in American history in the last 50 to 100 years, Sununu will not make the cut, and yet he was the smartest of them all academically. I can give you examples upon examples, but the essence of this message I'm trying to pass across is that success in life is a combination of intelligence, creativity, relentlessness, and emotional intelligence. I hope this works well for you. Do have an amazing day, and bye for now. A moron and a genius have the same number of brain cells. That's the beauty of life. All human beings have 100 billion brain cells, or neurons as they are called. So then, what makes a genius smarter than a moron? It cannot be the number of brain cells, definitely. It's more like, or more of, the number of neural pathways. I believe that a genius has been able to form more neural pathways than a moron or somebody who is averagely intelligent. So let's take two confectioners or two chefs, for example. They could go to the same catering school and learn how to make shawarma, for example. But what makes a genius is that a genius says, okay, I have learned how to make shawarma with this recipe. I am now going to try other combinations, while the average person just remains the same. So a genius says, I am going to try to make shawarma with carrots instead of cabbage. I'm going to try to make it with cucumbers. I'm going to try to make it with so many other leafy greens. I'm going to try to make it with broccoli. A genius says, I'm going to try many more combinations. Now, the more he tries more combinations, the more neural pathways are formed. In fact, a genius could say, I'm going to use cabbage, but experiment. I'm going to try more combinations with the amount of cabbage relative to maybe chicken or beef. Or I'm going to try to experiment and try more combinations with the combination of ingredients. So the more combinations he tries, guess what? The more neural pathways he's forming. And that's how geniuses become geniuses. They are willing to try more combination of things. They are willing to do more in terms of how many trials they can perform, and that's what makes a genius a genius. A genius neurosurgeon, take Ben Carson for example. You remember what Ben Carson said? Ben Carson said that on the average, neurosurgeons in America perform 170 operations every year, but I perform 250. So he did 80 more surgeries than the average neurosurgeon, and that was how he was able to solve complex complex problems and perform groundbreaking operations because he had seen more, he had tried more, he had done more. So becoming a genius is not rocket science. It's just applying some of these principles and forming more neural pathways so that when others get stuck, you have more inroads, meant cognitive inroads, and you know how to navigate complex problems. I hope this works well for you. Do have an amazing day and bye for now. The second area is with Albert Einstein, arguably the greatest genius who ever lived. Do you know that Albert Einstein never spoke a word until he was 3 years old? So for the first 3 years, he could not speak. Now, you will think that that's a disadvantage. Maybe the child has a medical problem or something, but I believe that because I have understood and studied the connection between excessive talking and shallow thinking, the fact that he did not say too much in his first 3 years gave him the ability to be very introspective and be a person of deep thought. When Albert Einstein died sometime in 1965 at Princeton University, the pathologist Thomas Harvey chopped up his brain to examine it, and he was discovered that the connection between his parietal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and corpus callosum were very thick, very, very strong. I believe that it was because he was a very deep thinker, and I believe that there was a strong connection between him not being able to speak for the first 3 years, which compelled him to do more of thinking than talking from a young age, that eventually culminated in the greatness of Albert Einstein. So in every disadvantage you will find advantages, and in every advantage you will also find disadvantages. Yeah, I want to talk about how to think like a genius, and if you learn this principle, it would make you a genius for life, and a notable one. It's a method that was adopted by the greatest geniuses: Leonardo da Vinci, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and so on and so forth. And so this is it. Whenever you want to think about a thing, think about how every other thing in life relates to that thing. And I'll show you how I practice this principle. So when I wanted to learn about neuroscience, this was the model I adopted. How does everything in life apply to neuroscience? So I started with temperature. How does heat affect the brain? How does cold affect the brain? Then I went to different seasons of life. I studied the child brain, I studied the teenage brain, I studied the woman's brain, I studied the male brain, I studied the brain of adults, I studied the brain of athletes, then I studied the brains of criminals, I studied the brains of entrepreneurs. I studied so many categories of how these things affect the brain. Then I studied how fear affects the brain, how sex affects the brain, how anger affects the brain, how excitement affects the brain. I studied all this and all the different emotions. I studied how bitterness affects the brain, how hatred affects the brain, how pain affects the brain, you know. So it's about studying how everything relates to your one thing. That's what makes a genius in any field. Understanding how everything connects to that one thing. One more time, the way to build the thought pattern of a genius is to find out how everything in life affects that one thing. So a genius will go on and find out, how do proteins affect the brain, carbohydrates affect the brain, how does fruits and veggies affect the brain, how does oil affect the brain, you know, things like that. How does geography affect the brain? Yes. How does comedy affect the brain? How do horror movies affect the brain? How do cartoons affect the brain? And so a genius will try to find out, how does color affect the brain? How does the color red affect the brain? Green, white, yellow, blue, black, and all that affect the brain. He will find out how money affects the brain. How does fame affect the brain? How do things affect the brain? And that's how a genius thinks. That's how a genius thinks. I said on many occasions that the greatest comedic genius was Mrs. Doubtfire. Richard Williams. Call him Mrs. Doubtfire because of that iconic movie about Richard Williams, who committed suicide, sadly enough. But the beauty of him was that he was able to say, okay, I'm going to learn 40 different accents. So he could speak with the accent of a Nigerian and in a second switch to the accent of an Indian. And you will not even tell that he switched because he was so good, he was so flawless at it. So you want to ask, okay, how does jazz music, for me, I wanted to know, how does jazz music affect the brain? How does Fuji music affect the brain? How does hip hop, fast, how does punk rock, how does alternative, how does hard rock, metal affect the brain? How does R&B affect the brain? You understand? I found out that, okay, when you are doing things with your hand, do they have a different impact on the brain compared to when you are doing things with your feet? That's how a genius thinks. They try to look for how everything affects the brain. In fact, they go deeper. Does yellow light have a different impact on the brain than blue light, than purple light, than green light? That's how a genius thinks. I wanted to find out, do sleeping positions affect the brain? So if I sleep on my back, does it have a different impact on my brain compared to if I sleep on my side? That's how a genius thinks. I want to find out, okay, if I kneel down, does it have a different impact on my brain compared to when I sit down, when I stand up? Does walking have a different impact on my brain than jogging? Does jogging have a different impact on my brain than than cardio workouts or high intensity interval trainings or resistance training. That's how a genius thinks. You want to think about how everything has an impact on the brain, because you are a specialist or an expert on the brain. So you want to think about how everything impacts the brain. So I would say, okay, does reading have a different impact on my brain than watching? So if I'm watching a documentary, does it have a different impact compared to if I was reading the same thing about the same person? That's how a genius thinks. So I wanted to know, if I am analyzing, does it have a different impact on my brain than if I'm reasoning? Does it have a different impact on my brain than if I'm reflecting? Does it have a different impact on my brain if I'm consolidating memory? I'm trying to remember a thing or trying to form a memory. Does wishful thinking have a different impact on my brain than analytical thinking? You know, that's how a genius thinks. They think about how everything relates to that one thing. I hope you understand how to think like a genius. I hope it works well for you. I look forward to hearing your testimonies. God bless you. Do have an amazing day, and bye for now.